It's time we continue with what Professor Plink has to say. Check part 1 for the introduction. Here I need to make a note and remind you that in part 1 I make a distinction between several types of atheists, and the ones I'm addressing in this video are the ones who are like Plink. I recommend you watch part 1 for more context.
The teleological argument says that stuff in the universe seems to have a purpose, so that means the universe must have had a designer. If you found a machine lying around, you would assume that somebody designed the machine. So the teleological argument tries to argue that the universe works like a machine, so somebody must have designed the universe.
Why do attempts to exemplify the teleological argument always fall back to man-made objects and then comparing them to the universe? A machine, whatever that machine may be, is a man-made object. We already know that it's man-made by the very nature of what it is. Why don't you use something complex that is not decidedly man-made? Like a snowflake, for instance. Snowflakes comprise complex geometric forms, and yet we understand how and why they form the way that they do, naturally.
No, we don't. According to science, we know how snowflakes form once we have the laws of the universe in place. We don't know why something would be a law of the universe in the first place. And if I grant you that snowflakes and other natural phenomena are undesigned, we can also tell about them that they decay and change over time. When we design things, such as the rules of a game, they don't change by themselves. So, until we can measure a decay or change in the laws of the universe, then they have more in common with something designed than with something undesigned. I would be curious how you will measure that, since a whole lot of science will break if the laws of the universe change, given that that would mean that experiments are no longer repeatable, since performing an experiment before the laws were changed would give a different result than after the laws were changed. So we'd only have our records to tell us that. But even that isn't conclusive proof, given what you can read in the Trisolaran trilogy. An intelligent entity could also change the laws of the universe if it had access to that. So you really cannot approach this trivially.
But, of course, theists tend to think everything, absolutely everything, including snowflakes, are all designed by God. So there's literally nothing a non-believer could ever point to as undesigned. Meaning that the teleological argument, in the mind of a theist, is an unfalsifiable argument. Which means that it should be revised or discarded if one is actually attempting to find truth. Because a key part of any hypothesis is its conditions of falsifiability. But hey, don't let logic or intellectual honesty get in the way of what you think is a mic drop moment for your position, am I right?
I'll have to throw that ball back in Plink's court. But before that, I need to make an observation about a question. Who knows, maybe I'll put it in my questions for atheist video. What makes something undesigned? For a Christian, okay. Undesigned things don't exist. Everything is either designed by humans, by animals, or by God. But how do you tell that something is undesigned? Just because it's not in the list of things we've seen designers do? Is design just a list of things we know people did? Also, wouldn't that be undermined if we begin designing the things that are now known as undesigned? For example, we can make artificial snowflakes. We know artificial snowflakes are designed, so what makes natural snowflakes undesigned? Doubly so when you cannot tell them apart. What will you be able to say about, oh, the natural world isn't designed, when human designers would have the capacity to make anything existing in the natural world, but intentionally? Did I just discover a reverse God of the gaps? Like the time when you use naturalistic processes so much that you can no longer automatically exclude the supernatural explanations? You know, because the natural begins to have the properties previously only assigned to the supernatural, so we can no longer ignore the connection between natural and the supernatural? Even ChatGPT likes the way I describe that. Okay, though, to be fair, the examples it gives when it tries to express that kind of suck. Anyway, where were we? The only condition for design which he offered was experience. I granted you the position that you offered as an example of an undesigned thing that was indeed undesigned, drew conclusion about what it would mean to be undesigned, compare it to something designed, though granted, if I were to apply it to something physical like a car, I would do it like the following. Let's say that a car was designed and it broke down. How could we tell it's designed? Well, depending on the stages of breakdown, by its incompleteness. It's not an endless series of expanding matter according to arbitrary rules. We clearly see that some parts of it are missing, and filling those gaps and only them would make it complete. An allegedly undesigned thing like a snowflake doesn't work that way because there is nothing intrinsically about it which tells us when it's supposed to be complete. And, for example, a natural structure which could be filled like one of those hexagonal stones, but imagine it had a broken edge, would still fall into this category because it can continue indefinitely up. So, which of us is attempting to slam dunk a standard with a thought-terminating cliché? Something you will hear me say a lot, and I do mean a lot on my channel, is a sentence, "You can always make something seem less defensible if you ignore more about it," or variations on it. And most mid-witted positions, like capital A atheism, stop at a random point from which they can attack a standard which they dumbed down or were pedantic about, but which has more elegant formulations which attack the critics themselves by looking at the standard more carefully or in its totality.
But there's also things Darwinian evolution can't explain, like the 4 constants of the universe. There are physical constants like the gravitational constant and the electron charge, the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force that are perfectly fine-tuned, such that if they were even the slightest bit different, the entire universe would immediately collapse in on itself.
To say that the fundamental forces of the universe are fine-tuned requires that those forces had a reasonable chance of being different from what they are.
If you're at home, wondering to yourself if he got that standard from anyone arguing for fine-tuning it like that, or if he conjured it out of thin air? Nah, we both know he made it up. No, that's not what fine-tuning means. It starts with the observation that we have life. We then, under naturalism, look at the laws that describe the universe and see that they have several constants. We then notice that changing these equations by nearly imperceptibly small amounts makes life impossible. So among all possibilities of life existing and life not existing, because there are so many possibilities for life not to exist, if the universe is made naturally, we know that we're an incredibly small space of possibility. On the other hand, we know that a god could have made sure life existed much more reliably because he's omnipotent and willed life. I don't know what atheist-serving pop philosophy mental gymnastic you use to reach that reasonable chance description, but the people talking about fine-tuning more seriously, like Apologetics Squared, don't have that native version of it. He also believes that it's not that convincing, but that's neither here nor there. He even goes into a version of the argument more complex, which I will let you watch on your own.
Well, prove that it's even possible for the forces of the universe to be different from what they are.
That's unironically moving the goalpost because you introduce something never considered in the original formulation.
Prove that it's even possible for gravity to have a different constant, or for the nuclear force to work differently than it does.
Prove that it has to work the way it does. If you remember the fine-tuning argument, it just talks about what happens and what would happen if things were different. It never talks about things having to work a certain way. So, when you're done instinctually bridging the is-odd gap, we'll wait for you with the fine-tuning argument, because currently, you're not ready to address it.
The ontological argument says God exists because of the way he is. Bruh.
Yeah, the ontological argument is the purest theistic bullshit in all of apologetics.
I'll wait for the rest of his description, since you've proven unreliable.
If you really want to hear RZ ramble about it, go watch the original video.
You're in no position to be condescending, mate.
No, seriously. God is defined as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. That means God must be all-powerful, because being all-powerful is greater than having limited power. God must be all-knowing, because being all-knowing is greater than having limited knowledge. God must be all-good, because being all-good is greater than being flawed. And God must exist, because existing is greater than not existing. Wait, just because we can think of a greatest possible being doesn't mean it actually exists. Well, actually it does, because existing in reality is greater than just existing in the mind. Okay, but I could use that to argue for the existence of the greatest possible pizza. Well, actually, no, you can't, because the definition of pizza implies limitations like a limited size and able to be broken. If you had a pizza that was indestructible, eternal, all-powerful, and infinitely large, it wouldn't be a pizza anymore, it would just be God. Basically, if your pizza gets infinitely great, it'll turn into God.
Here, now let's see how you describe it.
But it all comes down to attempting to define God into existence. God is defined as the greatest being imaginable, and actually existing is greater than not existing, so therefore God must exist.
All that's saying is that when you talk about God, you talk about something which exists. Pretty easy notion, really.
The only retort needed to this flotsam, well, other than,
That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
is that definitions are descriptive, not prescriptive.
Yes. All the ontological argument is saying is that when you talk about God, you describe something which exists. When you talk about something which doesn't exist, you necessarily no longer talk about God, even if you use the same word. It doesn't mean you should believe God exists because the concept of God talks about something which has to exist. At least not in this formulation. There may be other people who say it differently.
Definitions come from observation and understanding of a thing.
No, otherwise new concepts would be impossible. If what you said was true, then architecture would be impossible, because we don't observe the shape of a building before it is built. We first define it, then build it.
We define a fish as a creature that swims not because we insist upon it, but because we observe it swimming.
This is already addressed in the original video, here.
Okay, but I could use that to argue for the existence of the greatest possible pizza. Well, actually, no, you can't, because the definition of pizza implies limitations like a limited size and able to be broken. If you had a pizza that was indestructible, eternal, all-powerful, and infinitely large, it wouldn't be a pizza anymore, it would just be God.
Also, I can imagine a being greater than the God you're proposing. I mean, part of your conception of God is that God is unchanging. You went over that back during the cosmological argument. The unmoved mover, the unchanging changer. Well, being able to change is greater than not being able to change.
No, it isn't, because a thing changing implies a state in which something about it was weaker, and never having been weaker is greater than at some point having been.
I can imagine a God who is rigid and unmovable when it wishes to be, but can also be infinitely flexible if it chooses.
So for you, God is a physical being. This is a category error.
So this super God that I imagine has more free will and more abilities than your God does.
No, it doesn't. You just misunderstand the concept you're aiming for.
But wait, that would just mean that the super God that I'm imagining is actually the God that you're thinking of, right? Since your God is defined as the greatest being imaginable. But no, it's not the same being, because you believe that the God that you're thinking of created the whole universe. But the super God that I'm imagining, it didn't create the universe, but instead gave that task to a lesser powered being, which would be the God that you're thinking of.
Bloody Gnosticism.
Because delegating to others is greater than being forced to do something yourself.
This was the most tedious moving the goalpost in the world. Actually, the God that you're thinking of and I'm misdescribing is not the God that you're describing correctly. Mine is. It's so tiresome.
There is also the argument from personal experience. It may sound silly, but everyone does see the world through the lens of their own personal experience. A lot of people are convinced God exists either because of supernatural events they've seen, or because of answered prayers, or just coincidences in their life. So this is very good at convincing oneself that God exists, but not very good at convincing other people.
Wishful thinking. You misunderstand something that happens and assume it was a supernatural event when it wasn't.
And now you're being dishonest again. To declare that someone else's experience is a misunderstanding, you need to know what the actual thing was. So you giving a blanket statement that it's wishful thinking when you don't know what happened is just your dishonesty.
The transcendental argument basically says without God, nothing can make sense at all. There's a lot of things we assume, but we can't prove. We assume that logic works. We assume that there's consistency in the natural world. We assume that truth exists, but we can't prove any of these things scientifically, because these are the basic assumptions we need to make to even do science. All of these things make sense if we presuppose a worldview where God exists, because then we can say all these other things are grounded in the mind of God. But if God doesn't exist, then we have no justification for the things we assume, and everything just collapses.
This is sometimes called presuppositional apologetics, or the people making these claims are sometimes called presups if you run into them online. And they are as silly as their line of thinking sounds.
Oh, are they now? Well, then I'm sure you can ground those things as RZ presented them to you with no problems, right?
We don't just randomly think logic works or that there's consistency in nature based on nothing and for absolutely no reason.
Oh, really? So, what is the reason that logic works? Don't tell me. It just works. It just does. We notice it consistently. Or something. But definitely no argument which goes, therefore logic has to work. Therefore the laws of the universe have to work.
In fact, we have every reason to think these things. Literally 100% of the evidence that we have indicates these things' consistency. We assume the same physical constants that we experience right now will be true tomorrow, not because we're basing that on absolutely nothing, but because they have proven to be constant for as long as we've been able to detect. Going all the way back to the Big Bang, the constants of the universe have been the same. To think that they will randomly and for no reason change tomorrow, that would be crazy. And it's the same thing with logic. We believe that logic works because, well, logic works.
Oh, is that right? Well, I sure hope somebody picks up that phone, because I f***ing called it!
The word we have for that is coincidence. Okay, that was fun. However, even though we're not done with the transcendental argument, I want to keep these videos around 20 minutes. It has different effects on the algorithm and I want to see how much. And plus, I'm making these to increase my catalog and have consistent uploads. Maybe someday I could make bi-weekly 40-minute videos, but it's not that time yet. There are 3 more videos remaining because I did find some extra material to work with. In the meantime, I make community posts with memes twice per day. Please like and share them because I have some special posts unlocked when I'll have a daily average of 10 likes for a week. You can send me more video suggestions in DMs or with the hashtags on screen. Like these videos if you like them, share them if you find anything useful. In fact, I recommend that if someone starts making a bunch of mistakes I respond to in my videos, you send my videos to those people instead of responding yourself. As future content on my channel will show, your time would be much better used elsewhere, and I don't want you to waste your time on people who should know better. And speaking of knowing better, I put the break for this video here to give the chance for the people who think they can find an alternative to the transcendental argument to have at least a week to think of what could it be. I work on making my videos more entertaining so they're easy to watch, even for people who are reluctant to click. Anyway, as the city motto goes, I see you, and have a nice week.